Jewish Problem. He serialized the protocols in his paper for 91 weeks and then published them all together in a book entitled The International Jew. It's been reported that Mr. Ford was able to sell 500,000 copies of the book. When Mr. Ford heard that Adolf Hitler, the head of the German government, was also concerned about the Jewish people, he decided to help him in his quest for power. This is a photograph taken July the 30th, 1938, of Mr. Ford receiving the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, presented by the German Consul General of Cleveland and the Council of Detroit. Of course, this photograph was taken many years after the 1920 Depression, but it shows just how committed Mr. Ford was in attempting to expose the supposedly Jewish members of the central banking establishment. Just for the record, I am not a believer in the Jewish conspiracy theory that many in America hold to, and in fact, I produced a DVD entitled The Bogus Jewish Conspiracy. The evidence that those who believe in this theory are dramatically wrong, and you can watch this DVD on the internet. Now let me discuss the recession we are currently in the years of 2013 and why we've not seen anyone end it. President Barack Obama is doing exactly the opposite of what President Harding did, and there is no relief from the effects of the recession. In around nearly 4.5 years of his administration, the end of the recession isn't even foreseeable in the near future. One can only wonder why President Obama is not following the successful record of President Harding, and the answer is obvious. Barack Obama does not want to end the recession. And the reason Barack Obama does not want to end the recession is because the Federal Reserve does not want him to. This recession is all about prolonging the recession to cause the most harm to the American people. And let me now try to prove that. This is a book entitled The End of Laissez-faire, meaning the free market, the free enterprise system, written by John Maynard Keynes, perhaps this nation's best-known economist of the 20th century. This is what he wrote on page 105 of his book. Vladimir Lenin, by the way, the communist Russian dictator of 1917 to 1923, is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. Lenin was certainly right. There is no sure means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. So now we see that the communists want to destroy the capitalist system by debauching the currency. Now that is happening in America as we speak. Now let me proceed with a brief discussion of the crash of 1929, where billions were lost in the new stock crash. When I was researching my book in the 1970s and 1980s, I looked for explanations as to what might have caused the crash of 1929. I found this book, amongst others, entitled The Great Crash 1929 by John Kenneth Galbraith, and I read it. Mr. Galbraith was described as a Keynesian, meaning John Maynard Keynes was his hero, and that he, meaning Mr. Galbraith, was a leading proponent of 20th century political liberalism. He served in the administrations of President Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, and Lyndon Johnson, all of whom were also leading proponents of 20th century political liberalism. These are his conclusions about the cause of the Great Crash of 1929 from pages 4, 32, and 172. No one was responsible for the Great Crash. There was none who caused it. Although you got to give him credit, he does admit this, and there's a reason, I believe, for this. Hold on. The Federal Reserve Board was a body of startling incompetence. So no one caused it, but whatever caused it, the Federal Reserve Board was incompetent to prevent it and then stop it. But Galbraith did agree with his hero, John Maynard Keynes, who wrote this in a quotation I read earlier. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. In other words, some people benefit from crashes. This is how Mr. Galbraith put it. The man with the smart money, who was safely out of the market when the first crash came, meaning the beginning of the crash, naturally went in to pick up bargains. In other words, those with the smart money who got out of the stock market before the crash started went back in and bought bargains, meaning stocks at a much lower price. Naturally. In all of my research, I've never found one writer who discussed just who it was who was buying all of these stocks being sold. We always talked about the sellers, but not the buyers. But you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that for every stock sold, a share is bought. Both of these two economists, Keynes and Galbraith, told us that the people with the smart money, those who got out of the market before the crash happened, went in and naturally bought every stock sold. Maybe, just maybe, that was why the Federal Reserve Board was startlingly incompetent. It was to allow the people with the smart money, naturally, to come back in and buy stocks at a dramatically lower price. And to be perfectly honest with you, I believe that Galbraith did know what caused the crash and that he intentionally lied. Don't forget, he was, quote, a proponent of 20th century political liberalism, end quote. But I want to make it clear. I found the evidence that the Federal Reserve did plan both of these depressions, and I provided that evidence in my book entitled The Unseen Hand. I will briefly explain just how they created the crash of 1929. First of all, I'm going to round these figures I will present just to make it a little easier to understand. It all started after the Depression of 1920. The Federal Reserve had $34 billion of money in circulation in June of 1920, and each of these figures will be in June of that year. They decreased it to $32 billion in 1921. $33 billion in 1922, $36 billion in 1923, $38 billion in 1924, $42 billion in 1925, $43 billion in 1926, $45 billion in 1927, and a high of $46 billion in 1928. Then the Federal Reserve leveled it off to the same $46 billion in June of 1929. They had increased the money supply by 44% from June of 1921 to June of 1929. Now this is how the media contributed to the Depression of 1929. They were convincing the public to invest in the stock market where you could become as rich as John D. Rockefeller, perhaps this nation's wealthiest businessman. The Federal Reserve was encouraging the public to borrow some of the increase in the money supply to invest in the stock market. This was what they were doing with the extra money they had increased the money supply by. So you hear that you buy stocks with the assistance of a stockbroker. So you call and make an appointment. You tell him you have $100 that you want to invest in a purchasing stock and that you want to buy one share of Epperson Popsicle Company. You tell the broker that I recommended this company because it was an Epperson who invented the popsicle, and you want to share in the good fortunes of the Epperson family. He goes on to explain how the system works. You invest $100 in Epperson Popsicle, and if the stock goes up 10% to $110, you'll make a 10% profit. And you start thinking, boy, this is easy. And then you reassure yourself by thinking that this must be how John D. Rockefeller made his fortune, by starting small. But then the stockbroker tells you that the banks are allowing tycoons such as yourself to borrow money to buy stocks. It is called buying on margin. He then explains what that means. You will still invest your $100. But since the margin is 10%, you can borrow $900 and invest $1,000, meaning the 100 plus your 900, to buy 10 shares at $100 apiece. Then if your 10 shares go up 10% to a total of $1,100, you will make a $100 profit, which means you will equal your original investment. You can make 100% profit with just a 10% increase in the price of your stock. Now you can start to see just how you can really become as rich as John D. Rockefeller. So you agree, as all tycoons did, you agree to purchase 10 shares for a total of $1,000. And then the stockbroker then says, there's one more thing that I've got to show you so that you'll understand. The banks are loaning you this money on what they call a 24-hour broker call loan, which means that they can call the broker and ask him to call the loan, and you will have 24 hours to sell your stock and pay off the loan. But all you can think about is the prospect of becoming as rich as John D. Rockefeller. And with the rising stock market, what's the danger? You certainly can sell your stock in 24 hours and pay off the loan. So you leave the broker's office and you start thinking about how you're going to buy that yacht you've always dreamed about. And as time passes, the stock market is climbing and everybody's happy. Until October the 24th, 1929, when the Federal Reserve told the banks to call their 24-hour broker call-owns, and stockbrokers all over the country started selling the shares of all of their tycoons, and the stock market started falling rapidly. And all of the tycoons would get a call asking them to come into the office to talk about this. But notice that all of the stockbrokers had to sell their stocks at the same time. And whenever many people start selling their shares at the same time, prices go down. Now let's just make up an example to see what happened. When your broker sold your 10 shares of Epperson Popsicle, let's just say that he was able to find a buyer for, say, $400. He would sell your stocks for $400, and he would then give you a check for that amount. He would point out that the banks had loaned you $900, and they wanted you to return the full amount of the loan. The stockbroker would say, "When are you going to come up with the additional $500? And you would say, "JG, I know this is all you could get for my 10 shares. I'm really sorry, but the stock market is down, and that's the best you could do." The stockbroker will express his deep concern and then repeat his question. "How are you going to come up with the additional $500? This is how the Federal Reserve created the 1929 crash. But notice this, not all tycoons lost money in the crash. Some of them got out of the market in 1928. One such tycoon who did exactly that was Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President John Kennedy. He got out by selling all of his stock in the winter of 1928 and the spring of 1929, about a year before the stock market crashed. Now, you are not going to presume, of course, that he somehow got advance information about the coming stock market crash of 1929. We all know that he got out early because he was a shrewd tycoon, and author Gary Allen said this about what he did with his money. The profits he took from the sale of his holdings were not reinvested, but were kept in cash. So after the crash reached a low in prices, the father brought his cash back to the market and started buying at a low price. Yes, indeedy. While the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. Let me now add the comments made by Congressman Lewis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking Committee from 1920 to 1931, meaning the times of both of these depressions. These are his comments made after the crash of 1929. We have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board of the Federal Reserve Banks. He further amplified his remarks with his comment that the cause of the depression was not an accident. It was a carefully contrived occurrence. His concerns were confirmed by Dr. Carroll Quigley in his book entitled Tragedy and Hope, published in 1966. Dr. Quigley was a professor at Georgetown University after teaching at Princeton and Harvard, and he also completed his bachelor's, master's, and doctor's degree at Harvard University. Dr. Quigley got some instant acknowledgement after he was praised by Bill Clinton at the Democrat Party's convention on July the 16th, 1992, during his acceptance speech. And the reason he was because he was Bill Clinton's professor at Georgetown from 1964 to 1968. We know that Quigley's book, published in 1966, was required reading for Quigley's courses, so the public can read the book that we know Bill Clinton read. And since he praised Quigley, we know that what Quigley believed in, Clinton believes in. This is what Bill Clinton read in Quigley's book. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim. Nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. And this confirms why the American people do not know much about the Federal Reserve. It is because they operate in secrecy, because they're not controlled by the U.S. government. They're controlled by the central banks of the world acting in concert. The Federal Reserve stands convicted by the evidence. But it is more important at this point to discuss other things that Dr. Quigley taught Bill Clinton. He wrote that the financial element was controlled by a much larger and more powerful group that he called the International Anglophile Network. The word Anglophile means that this network is primarily English. This is what he wrote on page 950 of his book. There does exist, and has existed for a generation, an international Anglophile network. So the banks are controlled by an international network out to control the world through their control of the central banks. And Quigley taught Clinton that this network controls the elections for the presidency of the United States. This is what Quigley wrote on page 73 of Tragedy and Hope. The network expected to control both political parties equally, meaning, of course, they wanted to control both the Democrats and the Republicans. Some of them intended to contribute to both in order to conceal their influence. And listen to this comment, America, and allow the electorate to believe they were exercising their own free choice. Notice what both Quigley and Clinton think of the American voter. They believe, like this network believes, that we are too stupid to see how they control both candidates for the presidency equally. That means that no matter who we elect, that candidate was controlled by this international network. So let me urge you to stop voting for any of the two major presidential candidates. It simply does not matter who wins the election. They win and we lose. While I'm here discussing the thoughts of Dr. Quigley, I would like to address the concerns that many have that it is the Rothschild banking family that controls the international world of banking. Because they are wrong. They are wrong. Dr. Quigley identified 12 banking families that control the international world of banking, and this is his list. He said these banking families include Baring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, the Spayers, Mirabad, Malay, Fold, and above all, Rothschild and Morgan. Of course, many historians have written about the last two family names, but I would dare say the others are unknown to the American people. Now what follows is a very devastating bit of information from Dr. Quigley. This is what he wrote. To do this, meaning allow the bankers to control the money supply, it was necessary to conceal or even to mislead both governments and people about the nature of money. This is the movie actor Jack Nicholson in the movie entitled A Few Good Men. He was portraying a major in the U.S. Marines who had lied in court stating that he had not issued a specific order. And here he is loudly mouthing the reason he has lied. Nicholson says, "You cannot handle the truth. This must be the reason the bankers are lying to us about the nature of money." Now let me bring this all together with a discussion of how this financial element creates money out of nothing. This will be a brief, simplified illustration, hopefully just to keep it easy to understand. There are three principles in this illustration: the President of the United States, the Federal Reserve, and the Treasury Department. The process starts when the President requests that each of the departments of the government submit their budget for the next fiscal year. And let's say that it totals in round figures $4 trillion. He then asks the Internal Revenue Service to submit an estimate of the amount of taxes to be collected during the next fiscal year, and let's say that totals $3 trillion. That means, of course, there will be a budget deficit of $1 trillion. Now let's assume that the President doesn't know what to do. One of his advisors tells him to call the Federal Reserve, and they will get him the money he needs to balance the budget. So the President makes a call to the Federal Reserve and says, "I need $1,000, $1 trillion, $1 trillion. The bank says, "We're certainly pleased that we can assist you, Mr. President," and they notify him that they will be happy to accommodate his request. The President tells the Federal Reserve to provide the government with $1 trillion so he can balance the budget. The Federal Reserve then calls the Department of the Treasury and tells them to print $1 trillion in small denomination bills. Notice that this money will be created out of nothing. The Treasury Department prints up the money and then notifies the Federal Reserve that their money has now been printed. The Federal Reserve then calls the President and notifies him that his money is ready. The President tells them to deliver it to the government, and the government will deposit it in the federal government's account in the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve then says that they want some evidence of the transfer of the money since they are loaning the money to the government. And the President responds by confessing he doesn't understand. He says, "Wait a minute, I'm the President of the federal government, and that I'm calling the Federal Reserve, which means that both of us are part of the federal government." And then the Federal Reserve responds by informing the President that he's slightly misinformed. They tell him that the name Federal Reserve is not their entire name. Why, we're called the Federal Reserve Bank. And even though we have the name Federal in our name, we're not part of the federal government. We're a privately owned bank, and just like any other bank, we are in the loaning business. And that we will need the government to pay the loan back with an annual rate of interest. And for this loan, they advise the President they will loan him the money at, let's say, 10% interest a year, and that the reason we must charge interest is because we're a bank, and just like any bank, we have bills to pay. And the President says, "Well, I guess this is the way that this is done." So he asks, "What do I do next?" And the Federal Reserve responds by saying to the President, "Have the Treasury Department print up $1 trillion in bonds as an evidence of the debt. The President then calls the Treasury Department to print up the bonds and instructs them to have the bonds reflect a 10% interest rate a year. The Treasury Department removes the plates they use to print the money and replaces them with the plates to print the bonds. When this is accomplished, the Treasury Department calls the President and advises him that the bonds are now ready for delivery. So the President then calls the Federal Reserve and advises them that the bonds are ready. And the Federal Reserve counters by saying that their new money has been printed and they begin the delivery. The trucks from the Treasury Department pass the trucks from the Federal Reserve on the highway, and after each has delivered their cargo, everybody's happy. The government now has the money to pay all of their government bills. Their budget is balanced. And the Federal Reserve now has a guarantee that the federal government will pay the interest on the bonds so that they can pay their bills. Now let me point out in my example, the amount of money borrowed was $1 trillion, and the amount of annual interest is $100 billion at an interest rate, of course, of 10%. Yes, I failed to mention that bonds are issued for a certain period of years, which means that the government will pay $100 billion a year for, say, 20 years. So that means that the total interest will be $2 trillion during the 20-year term. Now let me explain one additional thing. Paying interest on bonds is not like paying interest on a mortgage. Let's just say that you borrowed $10,000 to buy my house. Please do not think that all authors get rich by selling their books. I'm certainly living proof of that. In fact, this is the sign I made so I could stand on street corners selling my books. Let's just say that the bank loans you the $10,000 and you pay it off with a payment of $100 a month. Some of that money goes each payment to reduce the amount you have to pay back, called the principal, and the rest goes for interest. That means that for each $100 payment you make, it reduces the amount of interest you pay each month and increases the amount applied to the principal. But notice this, under our example, the government pays the same interest each year, but there's no reduction in the amount of interest applied as you make the next payment. The government pays $100 billion each year for 20 years, or a total of $2 trillion. And then, at the end of the 20 years, the government will be asked to return the $1 trillion that the Federal Reserve loaned them. So that means that the total cost of funding this $1 trillion deficit will be $2 trillion paid in interest plus the $1 trillion payment at the end of 20 years for a total of $3 trillion. But notice this. In this example, the Federal Reserve makes a $2 trillion profit for loaning $1 trillion to the government. Plus they get to use the $1 trillion that they created out of nothing, again in another loan to the government. Ralph Epperson, noted international author, says, hey, not too shabby. And yes, one more thing. Notice that when the president talks about funding a deficit, he always fails to mention the amount of interest it will cost us taxpayers each year to borrow from the Federal Reserve. I'm sure that is just one little detail that the presidents forget when they discuss the process. Oh, I forgot one little insignificant detail. I do not know for certain if the Federal Reserve loans the federal government $1 trillion in cash that the government will deposit in the Federal Reserve Bank. It might be just a bookkeeping entry transferring the money from the Federal Reserve to the U.S. government. But I do know this. The Federal Reserve pays the Treasury Department for the printing of any money. Marilyn Beaucevant discussed this in her February 8, 2009 column in Parade magazine. She was asked, what does it cost to print U.S. currency? And her answer was, a paper note costs 6.2 cents to print. Now let me explain what she just said. It costs 6.2 cents to print any denomination bill. The Federal Reserve loans the $100 bill to the U.S. government, and it costs them 6.2 cents to print it. That is a profit of approximately $99.94 to loan the U.S. government $100 in cash. Once again, Professor Epperson, not too shabby. So let me summarize this whole subject of funding the national debt. When the government borrows the money from the Federal Reserve, it causes debt, meaning we have to pay the Federal Reserve back, just like a private citizen does when they borrow money from a bank. It causes inflation when the Federal Reserve puts this new money into circulation. And it costs us in interest payments just like anyone has to pay when they borrow money. That doesn't sound like much of a bargain to me. This transaction causes debt, inflation, and interest. But there are at least three other ways to fund a deficit budget. The second way would be to borrow from the American people. This was one of the ways that President Franklin Roosevelt funded World War II. Hollywood actors and actresses like Joan Crawford went on national bond drives encouraging the American people to loan money to the government as a way to pay a part of the costs of the war. This method does cause debt because the taxpayers have to pay the money back. It does not cause inflation because there is no increase in the amount of money in circulation. But it causes interest payments that the taxpayers have to pay the American people who loan their money to the government. A third way would be for the government to put the printing plates that print paper money on the printers and then just print. This method does not cause debt since nothing has been borrowed. It causes inflation because it increases the money supply. But it does save the taxpayers interest payments. And the fourth way would be to tax the people, declaring that if you want the services, you have to pay for them. This method does not cause debt because nothing is borrowed. It does not cause inflation because it is not an increase in the money supply. And it does not cause interest payments because nothing is borrowed. Now this is a table showing the four methods that are available to the U.S. government when it has a deficit budget. Which one is the worst way as far as the taxpayers are concerned to fund the deficit? Of course, number one, borrowing from the Federal Reserve. And yet the government consistently chooses method number one, the worst possible way to fund a deficit. Now, which is the best way to fund a deficit budget as far as the taxpayers are concerned? It is, of course, method number four because it does not cause debt, inflation, and interest. But government never chooses that method because tax increases are not popular. Now we can begin our study of the recession America is currently in. This is an article that appeared in the New York Times newspaper on September the 30th, 1999, and it states that Fannie Mae, the government-sponsored enterprise that keeps money flowing to the housing and mortgage markets, will encourage banks to extend home mortgages to individuals whose credit is generally not good enough to qualify for conventional loans. Notice that the government is encouraging the banks to make loans to people that they know will not pay them back. There's not a banker in the world who will make loans that he knows will not be repaid. Yet the government is urging him to do so. The article then says that Fannie Mae is, quote, under pressure from the Clinton administration, meaning the administration of President Bill Clinton, to expand the number of these loans that the banks make. That means the Clinton administration was urging the banks to knowingly lose money. By the way, please notice that nearly everyone in this picture except the women standing to the left is wearing black, the color traditionally worn when you attend a funeral. Were Bill Clinton and the cabinet members wearing black as if they were attending a funeral? Perhaps they know something we didn't know. But the article then quotes an expert on mortgage loans as saying, if they fail, the government will have to step up and bail them out. Notice that this expert used the words bail them out. The man put his finger on the entire scheme. The Clinton administration knew it was going to fail and that there was a planned, quote, bailout, end quote, in the future. Let me explain the process on how this works. Step number one, the banks make the bad loans. They know they will be. And sure enough, in step number two, Fannie Mae bails them out so that the banks do not lose money. Step number three, Fannie Mae goes to the government and says, wait a minute, we need to be bailed out so we don't lose money. And sure enough, the government bails them out. Step number five, the government needs to be bailed out. So they borrow the money from the Federal Reserve so the government doesn't lose money. Step number seven, the Federal Reserve needs to be bailed out and they get paid back by step number eight, the taxpayers, so the Federal Reserve does not lose money. Step number nine, the only party to this pre-planned sequence that does not get bailed out are the taxpayers. We get no bailout. So the American people lose their jobs and their homes, just as planned. This article laid out the entire plan. It was started by the Clinton administration. The entire thing worked, and it's working today. And Barack Obama is smiling. So in conclusion, we've seen how central banks have been at the core of our wars and depressions since the American Revolution. But I must hasten to point out that this conspiracy is not made up of just central bankers. 50 years of my research has absolutely convinced me that it is 6,000 years old and has been in every culture and on every continent for that length of time. I would recommend that you consider watching my 4-hour DVD entitled The New World Order, Finally Explained on YouTube. Now let me end with this little story. There once was a very stupid man who tried to trick a very wise man. He put a peanut in its shell in his hand and then clenched his fingers to conceal the peanut from view. He approached the wise man and said to him, I will ask you one question, and by your answer I can tell if you are indeed a wise man. And then he showed the wise man his clenched fist. He asked the wise man this question, is the peanut in my hand in the shell, or is it outside the shell? Thinking that if the wise man said it is in the shell, he would crunch the peanut and then open his hand to reveal that it was outside the shell. If the wise man said it is outside the shell, he would open his fingers to reveal that it was inside the shell. The wise man thought for a few moments and then said, "The event is in your hand." Truly, wise men today will see that the future of their world is in their hands. Thank you so very much, and may God bless America.